Hello, Montreal. I'm super excited to be here at Startupfest, my first time in Montreal. Yes, it does sound like magic, using data when you don't have any data. And actually, on the bus ride over, I was telling the title of my talk to the shuttle bus driver. And he said, so does that mean you're encouraging people to steal data? No, nothing like that. But I care deeply about this topic. Going from being an engineer in plasma physics and computational plasma physics at Stanford, then a data scientist at Airbnb, now an angel investor with Sequoia, a mentor for first-round companies, I see this all the time. I see this all the time with early-stage companies, early-stage products inside of companies. They want to utilize data, they know they need to utilize data, but it's lacking, and they're not really sure for their stage of the company how to do it. So I want to walk you through the 4 stages of startup and how you might use data better at each stage. So those 4 stages that I've laid out, I love my 2x2s. I am a product manager, love those 2x2 axes. So no public product to public product, and no data to some data. And some data, I mean very limited data. You have some basic data available about your actual user using the product. So we're gonna start with stage 1. That's where most startups start. So just because you don't have any data doesn't mean you shouldn't start collecting it. You will need to move forward without data in this phase, but every strategy you undertake will generate information to support your success. So this is where most startups typically begin. They begin with some intuition, they begin with some user story, they begin with something that they care about, but they don't necessarily have user data to back it up. So you start with mission and vision. And when I listen to pitches from early stage companies, this is super important to me. Why is it that you're building this company? What is it that's driving you? I actually don't like pitches where they're giving me a McKinsey report on why the market opportunity is hot. That sounds very, dry, and it doesn't speak to why you are the right person to carry it forward. So starting with mission and vision is first and foremost. But with that, you can hack into other early data sources without having to buy a bunch of reports online just to piece together market size. You can, figure out search term traffic. You can figure out how many people are searching for certain keywords that are important to your product space. You can actually scrape comparable product data. You can go find comps and write a scraper to scrape their site to figure out various things about their product and their usage. Now, I'll say that, and the caveat is I'm not advising you to break the law, so respect robots.txt if you're gonna go that route, but that is one way to hack into early data about your potential users. But the key thing in this stage is just to determine what data you actually will need in your product. So you start out with that mission and vision, and from there, you say, okay, when we launch, this is the data that we will need to set yourself up for success. So in each of these stages, I'm gonna give an example of either something I worked on or a company that I invested in. This is a company that I invested in. It's called Actual. So Actual is a marketplace for sustainable infrastructure projects. It pairs infrastructure entrepreneurs with big investors that need to invest in those projects. This is a very stage 1 company. They basically just have a mission. Their mission is to fund the infrastructure that solves the Earth's most pressing problems. So they want to make sure that the money that's seeking to invest in these sustainable projects actually finds the entrepreneurs that want to push them forward. So they have a very coherent mission. And in talking with them, they've already done a lot of hacks. I don't think I can take that off. The mic's gonna come out. It's so hot in here, right? They've done a lot of hacks already to get to that data. Some of those hacks are just talking with potential customer after potential customer. Some of them are doing hacks like looking at their comps and trying to go do some deep background on the type of traffic that comps are seeing. Some of it is just basic market research. But this is a company that I invested in pre-product, pre-data, because they have a very strong mission and they know what data they will need going forward. So That brings us to, if you're in stage 1, your goal is probably to move to stage 2. So stage 2 is the no data, public product. So you've launched. You move from no data, no product, to no data still, and a product that you've actually launched. So your product is live. More startups are here than you think. You think, well, if I have a product, I should have some data, right? So that doesn't really make any sense. I have a live product, but no data. More startups are here than you think. There's a lot of reasons for that. One key reason is that they skipped stage 1. They actually didn't do a good job of defining what data they would need. And so they did the mission vision part, they rolled out a product, but they didn't define what data they would need, so they weren't prepared to collect it after the product actually launched. So they've been running on intuition for some amount of time and barely have any data or don't know how to utilize the data that is streaming in, and they're not really collecting it. So a lot of startups end up here, and I end up mentoring a lot of startups that have already launched and don't know that they have data, don't know what data they have, haven't figured out what data they actually need to collect. It's hard to move from intuition to data-driven. The reason that companies get stuck here is because it's actually hard. Because you start to believe you start to drink your own Kool-Aid. You start to believe that, hey, my intuition will drive everything. You start to believe you're Steve Jobs. Intuition doesn't scale unless you're Steve. No one else is. So you need to figure out a scalable solution for driving your product needs, and that tends to be data. But it is hard to move from that intuition, it's just about our mission and vision, to, oh wait, we actually need to use data and listen to our customers. So when you're in this stage, the key thing is to build in those data feedback loops. You're here, however you got here, whether you built the infrastructure to gather the data or not, make sure you're building in those data feedback loops into your product. Don't overinvest in custom infrastructure. This is another challenge that I see of startups at this stage. They say, hey, well, I can't collect data until I build all of this unique infrastructure. And do I use this service or that service? Do I use AWS? Do I use this cloud? And unless I architect the entire world, I can't possibly collect any data. Don't overinvest, and don't overthink it. Figure out what data you need. Collect that specific data. At this stage, do make analytics and OKRs your best friends. Analytics just means basic graphs of your user funnel. Basic graphs of how many people are using your product. Basic graphs of how much they're spending per touch. Basic graphs of engagement. Analytics, OKRs, what metrics do we care about, and how do we track those? I'm going to give an example here of a company that I'm a board member of. So I'm the board chair of Street Code Academy. So it's a nonprofit that went through Stanford StartX, which is a startup accelerator, to try to launch their for-profit arm. So this is a startup, a nonprofit startup that wants to turn for-profit or create a for-profit arm, and it serves the community by giving free coding and entrepreneurship classes to the entire community from everybody aged 7 to 70. So they've been around for 2 years. I've been on the board for those 2 years. They have some metrics, but we recently ran a session where they didn't actually know what data they had to actually support these metrics. So we ran a half-day deep dive into what metrics should you be measuring, and that should guide how you structure the data that you're collecting and how you look at your analytics. So they were trying to boil the ocean of like, hey, we have all of this data, we're collecting all of these things, and it was kind of scattershot. How do we use it all? Really, you need to focus in. And again, analytics and OKRs are your best friends. So stage 3. Stage 3, I have a little bit of a star because this is a special case. Not all products and not all startups end up here. These are usually spin-offs of larger companies or internal products. So, you're part of a small team doing a startup-y type project at Microsoft or Google, or you've spun out of a company. The caution here is that you have some data because you came from whatever that big company environment is. You're taking that data with you. But the caution is the data you have is probably not entirely the data that you need. And those caveats are very kind of scientist way of couching things, but this is probably not everything that you need. So do take the data that you have with a huge cup of salt. Not just a grain of salt, a cup of salt. Don't overcommit in one direction. And do, I think at this stage, leverage AI to uncover meaningful signal in the noise, because you have data. You're coming from a big company, you're coming from a spinoff, you have all of this data, but it's not all necessarily relevant to the new product that you're spinning out. And so make sure to leverage AI. So the example that I want to use here is actually within Airbnb. So in 2017, we launched Airbnb China. Entirely new market and actually an entirely new subsidiary company. It's a company that runs on its own. It has about 200 employees of its own, but it's a subsidiary of the parent company, Airbnb. At the beginning, Airbnb thought that, well, hey, we're already Airbnb. We can just use all the data that we have to figure out what we need to do in the China market. I just came back from spending 2 weeks in the China office trying to help them develop their payment strategy from a product perspective. And what I came back realizing is that you can't just port over these successes and the data that works in the US, not only because of data protection issues, not only because of that, but you can't just port over the data that works in the US into an entirely other country, an entirely other landscape, an entirely other product. Their products are fundamentally different. Their users expect fundamentally different things. They have fundamentally different methods. The templates are all different. And so Airbnb there is actually called IBing. So they changed the name of the brand. And much about the way our homepage works now, 2 years into it, much about the way the homepage works, a lot about the way the payments infrastructure works, a lot about the way the basic user flow works. They have features that the US market simply doesn't have. And our challenge is to allow them to accelerate in their direction without holding them back with sort of the global data. So the challenge here is that if you're launching some sort of internal spinoff, or you're launching a product within a company and it's new, and you think, well, hey, we have all of this massive user data, we'll just port it over to this new product. That doesn't always work. So consider what's new about the space and what lessons you can learn, but don't take necessarily everything with you. And so now you get to stage 4. So stage 4 is where you really want to be. You have some data, and you have a public product. So you're golden, right? Most startups I see are here, and this is probably 60 to 70% of the angel investments that I do. They have architected for some amount of data, and they do have a public product. They've invested in a lightweight data solution. They can tell a coherent story with data with some gaps, with some basic gaps. So they understand what their data is saying. They can find the data that they need. They can pull in new information and charts and graphs. So here, the key is to be agile. And I use agile with a lowercase a, not a capital A. So not agile, the framework. You don't necessarily have to do Scrum and retros and stand-ups and all of that, but agile with a lowercase a so that you can be responsive to the data when needed, so that you can actually understand what the data is telling you and react to it. So one challenge is that I've seen companies show me data about what their users are saying, about what their growth trajectory is, but the strategy that they're taking is fundamentally driven by intuition. So they're not responding in an agile way to what their data is actually saying. So that's one challenge, is you know what the data is saying. How can you actually react to it? Do A/B test. At this stage, you should be able to do some basic A/B tests on most things, depending on your traffic. Now, you might not get to p-value stat sig, but you might, because the changes that you're making should be dramatic. So you should be able to see a 5-point swing or a 10-point swing with some change. But if you can't A/B test, you can do something called pseudo-testing. And I want to plant a little nugget here at the end. I'm going to leave about 2 minutes for questions. So be mulling over questions, and there'll be someone with a mic coming around in case you have any. So do A/B tests, do pseudo-test in order to drive your product and make sure the things that you're doing are causal and not simply a correlation with where the market is going anyway. And I advocate teams at this stage to use machine learning sooner rather than later. So actually start getting into building basic models because that will accelerate your growth, that will pay dividends later on. Now, I'm not saying do deep learning and neural networks. Don't go overboard. That's the next slide. Don't go crazy with it. but you should be building some basic models to better understand your data. And the key thing here, one key thing here is do hire a data science leader. A lot of companies are trying to have the head of engineering take it on, or the CEO themselves take it on. And at this stage, the CEO should be out looking for funding, the head of engineering should be driving the engineering organization, the product manager should be thinking about product vision. You probably need a data science leader to think about how to build out that data infrastructure and how to best utilize that data across the organization and how you're eventually going to scale it. So with this, I'm going to use the example, again, of Airbnb. So this is the first Airbnb office. This was at Rouse Street. This was the founder's apartment that they shared, and everybody would come here and push some dust together and work together. The person that I'm pointing to who's holding the paper up, that's Riley Newman. He's the person who hired me into Airbnb. He was the first head of data science at Airbnb. He was employee number 7. So that's earlier than most startups think that they can afford to have a data science leader. My argument is that you can't afford not to. So now Riley has moved on from Airbnb. He's actually a VC in his own right. He runs Wave Capital, doing fantastic work. But it was critical to Airbnb's success to have that data foundation early in the founding team, sitting around that same table with all the early employees. So he said, build a strong data culture early. It can be the difference between shutdown and success. And so now I will leave a minute for questions. And we have a hand here. Hi.
Question about when you're a B2B company. So I think about how many customers we have, and they're 24.
Yeah.
And there's some variability between
Yeah.
them, and they're different sizes. And you talk about statistical significance, and I'm salivating going, that would be great. But bridging that gap when you have a smaller data set
Yeah.
and you're selling to major companies,
Yeah.
advice on how to think about that?
Yeah, definitely. That's a fantastic call out. So this comes up a lot in B2B because you have a very few customers, but what you want to track are things like engagement or things like average. It depends on the type of product that you're running, but you can A/B test things like sales. You can A/B test things that are frequent touch. You can test things that are frequent touch. You can test things like engagement. You can test things that are outbound marketing. So you're constantly trying to get new customers. A lot of places where people don't test, A/B test is in their actual outbound marketing. So what is your email header? What is your email subject? Those are places where you can at least test click-through, opens, understand what the market needs and how you can tailor to that just by using basic content strategies. So those are some ideas. Thanks for asking. I think we have time for maybe one more? Okay.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you very much for your presentation.
Yeah.
My name is Edgar. I'm a co-founder of a company called Fit based out of the Next 36 Accelerator in Toronto. And we were recently discussing product methods using something from First Round. So how Superhuman built a product market fit engine, and they really focused on targeting users that were very disappointed, like they would survey them,
Yeah.
and only build features for those users.
Yeah.
Is that something that you recommend or implement based on your experience?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and unique strategy. So I'll abstract that away to say, focus on the outliers. So typically when you build products for the outliers that are really hard to build for, they're at some far end of the spectrum, it's an accessibility issue, it's some type of user that has some burning pain. So really what they're keying into is building for people with a burning need. And the people who are really disappointed but still using it, they clearly have a burning need. So that's who you want to surface. So that's the insight there, is build for people who have a burning need. And those sets of customer bases might look different. So yes, I would suggest build for folks that have a burning need of your product. Thank you, everyone. Great spending time with you.